Hello, this is Gail Killow, and this is my presentation for a curricular evaluation plan in regards to schools losing dedicated funding for homeless students. This is a new problem, but starting in 2026, there will no longer be any dedicated funding for schools to assist homeless students, and this is in particular for Indiana. Indiana is one of 36 states that rely entirely on federal funds to assist homeless students, so this means the loss of the entire funding. There's two layers to this. The Trump administration has recommended moving the current dedicated funding for homeless students into a new consolidated program called the K through 12 Simplified Plan. However, Indiana is requesting that all federal education funds, with except for a few exceptions, will be part of a larger block grant. This means that formerly dedicated funds will now have to be in a competitive format and are very likely to be overlooked. Schools have a unique definition of homelessness that is referred to as the McKinsey-Vento definition. Generally, it is more broad and in application than other federal agencies. The main definition is that students or homeless youth lack an adequate nighttime residence. This includes children and youth that are sharing the households of other persons due to loss of housing. This is oftentimes considered doubled up or couch surfing. They may be in a place not meant for human occupation, including cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, and substandard housing. And also, migratory children sometimes are included in our definition of homelessness as they lack a secure residence. There are four main rights protected by the McKinney-Vento Assistance Acts. These protect homeless students and must be provided by schools. The ability to remain in their school of origin, transportation provided to and from school, immediate enrollment, and equal access. Those are the four main rights, but in addition, there are approved activities that, if the funding is adequate, they can include tutoring and mentoring, expedited evaluation, professional development for educators and teachers, medical references, outreach, and specialized instruction that include domestic violence, language instruction, and many other approved specialized instruction necessary for the homeless student. Both root and gap analysis applies to the statement of problem, which is that dedicated funding is being lost in order for schools to assist homeless students. And it's almost as if there is a root history of gaps. So, in this case, so before the federal role in public education was established in the 70s, and this is when the states were strictly in control of funding and decisions. Students with disabilities, homeless, and vulnerable students were oftentimes turned away from schools or simply fell out of schools or were not served by them. And 1975, Congress passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and this is later reauthorized. But this really put an emphasis that schools must serve everyone, including those that are disabled or have homelessness or other vulnerable issues. So this means that with the Trump administration taking away dedicated funding at the federal level, and Governor Braun taking away dedicated funding at Indiana, you really have an issue where this history of gaps for certain students becomes both root and gap analysis. Both root and gap analysis applies to the statement of problem that there is no longer going to be dedicated funding for homeless students with federal funds. A lot of the controversial for the reanalysis really goes back to the creation of the United States Department of Education. This was controversial because of the ties of the National Education Association with then President Carter. And Reagan at the time actually campaigned to dissolve the education department, but was unsuccessful in doing so. But the education department was actually strengthened over the years to include standards and performance measures, and both parties have added a lot to the education department, but for the most part, it has been a support to states. And I believe that a lot of the controversy is that most people don't understand what the Department of Education is actually about at the federal level. And while the department was created because there were many problems in the states, now that it's been in place since 1979, many of those problems are now blamed on the Department of Education instead of the actual underlying problems. A root analysis as to why there is a loss of dedicated funding for homeless students. This is really based on politics, and one really needs to consider the landscape of the politics for education policy. One really does have to look at a landmark report that was put out in 1983 by Terrell Bell as secretary under President Reagan, and it called attention to many of the drastic issues with education and appointed many other commissions and studies. This really was a landmark that forever changed the history and is still considered controversial today as different sides and different interest group look at this report from different perspectives. From a critical standpoint, in 1990, the Secretary of Energy commissioned a report that basically redid the statistics and numbers, but in this case looked at the subgroups and breakouts and noticed that subgroups actually increased even though the overall average scores was declining. And something that's noted is that there are many more students, many more diverse students that were included in 1990 or even 1983 versus the decades in the past that were compared at a nation at risk. So in this case, the student populations were very different. And in prior years, many students were not even in the schools in order to be counted or to be reported. And I have to say, this has some personal impact on me as I have a grandmother who has a third grade education, loves education, read all the time, very smart. But she's a big reason why I have wanted to continue and get all the education opportunities I have because they were denied to her. But it was not uncommon for many folks to barely attend school at all. So there really is going to be more barriers and more risk and more variations when you include a greater diversity of students. The loss of dedicated funding creates a gap for schools and their ability to assist homeless students. The desired state is that schools will have adequate resources to help keep homeless students in school. Even with funding, homeless students are more likely to suffer from chronic absenteeism and have lower graduation rates. And having that assistance to keep them in school, have transportation provided, have enrollment aided, and being able to access the same activities that non-homeless students really helps for their education. And there is definitely going to be a gap created with this loss of dedicated funding. In addition, the funding pays for McKinney-Vento liaisons, and they are critical in identifying and helping assist homeless students. Two main national statistics regarding homeless students that really showcase the need and the fear of why losing dedicated funding is very much a real loss. Um, the biggest one is homeless students are much more likely to have chronic absentee rate. In some cases, this is how they are even discovered to be homeless. But homeless students at the national level are almost double the absentee rate for students in general. So this is something that really shows the need and as to why the McKinney-Vento is structured to help homeless students stay in their school of origin, provide transportation, and provide the supports that keep them stabilized. Unfortunately, though, there are still a lot of opportunities and equal access that is not given to many homeless students. They are much more likely to drop out and not graduate from high school in 4 years. Now, they may go back to school for like adult education programs and so forth. But there really is a downside to not being able to stabilize and serve homeless students in terms of quality of life and graduation. There are many homeless statistics that shows the needs for schools to help homeless students and also shows how they overlap with other vulnerable students. So oftentimes it's not even a matter of just being homeless, but they're vulnerable for various reasons. So there are subsets of homeless students that have disabilities, have limited English, are migratory children, or unfortunately are unaccompanied and not part of a household. And some fast facts is that there are 26 school districts that receive McKinney-Vento funds, which means they have homeless students, although there are homeless students in other school districts as well. And that there is the overall percentage of homeless students, and this is going to be an undercount because it's basically what is counted, and that's 1.6% of all Indiana students are homeless at some point in the year. Some additional statistics about Indiana for homeless students is that there are a lot more homeless students than the average person realizes. In the last year that was counted, there was over 16,000 homeless students identified in Indiana, and majority of those homeless students are going to be part of a homeless household, which means there may be siblings or a parent or a guardian that they reside with or don't reside with. However, even more vulnerable are going to be those that are unaccompanied. Of those that are homeless, since the McKinney-Vento homeless definition allows for homeless that are residing in other people's households, therefore considered doubled up or couch surfing, over 75% are in that category. So looking at the 16,000 number, that's probably going to be roughly about 12,000. But there are also homeless that are in shelters and in places not meant for human habitation. And a key difference is the HUD definition, House of Urban Development, is that they mainly are looking at the 25% of this statistic. As part of this assignment, I interviewed four people that are related to homeless students. Either they work for a school, they're a former homeless student, or they work at a shelter. And there were some key findings from those interviews. Um, The subject words were homeless and students, so obviously the most common words found in transcripts, but I was surprised that the most common word used was collaboration. But that really is a key for everything coming together as there are many people needed to provide a continuum of care for homeless students. Similar words to collaboration that were used for relationship building, wraparound services, and student teacher relationships. Something that initially surprised me but makes perfect sense is domestic violence was frequently mentioned as a need for educators to better understand, particularly to understand symptoms or signs in students. And but the most mentioned thing was the McKinney-Vento liaison was very critical. This is something where this position is almost taken for granted, as several mentioned that it would have a deep impact on them, requiring a lot of time and resources if that position did not ins- exist. And this is where it's good to have a human look at transcripts and look for themes and codes because when I was digging further into text, I saw a lot of talk about what would be considered a true generational approach, but the actual word was not used. So this was the ability of me being better than AI in this case, of recognizing that there was a theme, even though people were not using common language or words to describe a two generational approach. There have been several um, increases in the number of dissertations and journal reviews and reports that really showcase the importance of McKinsey-Vento for homeless students. But in terms of a literature review, these were my like general findings, and I highlight some journal dissertation or articles that can be further researched. The biggest is just a lack of awareness of homelessness among teachers, administration, and this is a major reason why homeless students are not assisted by their schools. Keep in mind that the success of McKinney-Vento funds is very much dependent on the due diligence of schools to identify homeless students so that they can be helped. And something else to remember is that homelessness is really not understood by those, especially that have never been in a homeless situation or not aware of the variety of homeless situation and experiences. So homelessness is better understood as a multifaceted spectrum. It's not whether you're homeless or not. There are a diversity of experience and issues, and this requires a variety and diversity of supports and resources for them. And this is another reason why having a dedicated homeless liaison or McKinney-Vento liaison that is well educated and understanding of homelessness really can help a school district. What really stood out as most important, and this came from the literature review, recommended best practices and tips, and even my own interview findings, was the importance of a McKinsey-Vento liaison or a homeless liaison, and sometimes those terms are used interchangeably. But there's something about the fact that having that dedicated person who is trained and knowledgeable is that they really bring all the other resources for a school together. So having this position is critical, and at first, even identifying homeless students. And this is something that's really on the best behavior and practices of a school to do their due diligence to identify homeless students. And then once they are identified, then they can be provided transportation if needed. They can continue to stay in the same school that they are attending. And it allows for a great deal of school stability as this person has the ability to really specialize and customize the resources needed for each homeless students. And they are also a big part of the community working with other homeless providers and agencies. And something that's critical too is that they oftentimes work with other funds. So they may work with Title I funds, they may work with Head Start funds, they work with disability coordinators, and really provide the ability to keep all of those different funds together, as oftentimes they overlap based on the needs of homeless students. To follow up on the importance of McKinsey-Vento liaisons or homeless liaisons is the fact they also interact with other funds that are crucial to homeless and vulnerable students. So having these positions also helps a variety of students that technically may not even be homeless, but helps keep everything together. So the loss of dedicated funding for these positions and funding also has an impact on several other funding as well. So commonly, they will also, as a liaison, work with Individuals with Disability Act funds, Title I funds, Head Start funds, Higher Education Act, the Perkins Career Fund, and Child Care funds, among many other funds. So this is something where McKinney-Vento requirements have been placed in 1987, and this is part of the infrastructure of many schools and school districts to have this liaison in place. And once again, this is another reason why losing this dedicated funding has impacts that may not have been considered. With the loss of dedicated federal funds for homeless students, this means that states will need a diversity of other funding, including state funds, so that they can assist homeless and vulnerable students. And something that is was put out by Schoolhouse Connection, and they went through all 50 states plus the territories to show that there are only bits and pieces that have been incorporated into state codes. This means that many states are going to rely entirely on federal funds, and this includes Indiana. There are actually 36 states, including Indiana, that solely rely on federal funds in order to assist homeless students. As the flexibility waiver is being recommended, part of that is that there should be flexibility between various funding, including state, local, and federal funds. So this is really a time where Indiana really should incorporate the entire McKinney-Vento requirements into the Indiana Code. So big part of my assignment is to prepare a policy brief and prepare recommendations so that potentially and hopefully a bill will be passed in the 2026 Indiana General Assembly so that there will be more opportunities for supporting homeless students as there is no longer that dedicated federal funds. This curricular evaluation plan assignment is part of a larger timeline, and it's a real timeline that I am in the middle of. Currently, there are two comment periods associated with rules or waivers requested by the Indiana Department of Education. So, currently, really getting the word out to advocate and to really make it known that homeless students and vulnerable students need to be protected and they are at risk now that there's no longer dedicated funding for those. And then there is also the need to protect funding because there is the goal of having more flexible funding, combining with state and other funding sources. Indiana and 36 other states have relied solely on federal statutes to be in compliance with schools assisting homeless students. To make it more likely that state funds can be utilized for assisting homeless students, it really needs to be incorporated into the Indiana Code. So I will be working with other advocates to create a brief and a recommended legislation that will then be presented to Representative Alex Burton, in the hopes that he will author this bill in the upcoming 2026 Indiana General Assembly. And there's two main components of that legislation. One is incorporating the McKinney-Vento requirements, and then also is the request for Indiana Department of Education to create a model curricular plan that basically it develops and intersects the requirements for homeless students to be protected, vulnerable students to be protected, and related dedicated funds, that this needs to be a curricular plan that is developed specifically for Indiana schools by the Indiana Department of Education. And the ideal is that would be a requirement through a legislation bill. So, in conclusion, there are three main end goals, and they were briefly mentioned as part of the timeline, but really want to emphasize the important. First is really to advocate right now for homeless and vulnerable students. With all this consolidation and changes, it's going to be very easy for them to be overlooked, even by those that mean the best for those populations. Two, in order to have the maximum flexibility available to provide assistance to homeless students and to provide flexibilities for schools, the McKinney-Vento requirements really need to be incorporated into the Indiana Code. So I will be putting together a policy brief along with other advocates, and we will be making a recommendation that there is a bill and hopefully an enrolled act that will come out of this that will allow easier funding opportunities for assisting homeless students. And also, very crucial to that is that there really needs to be a model curriculum that is published by the Indiana Department of Education. This needs to be included in their other curriculums, guides, resources, and reporting requirements that are basically being overhauled right now, due to the block grant funding and due to an overhaul in the system of how schools are rated and evaluated. So all of this is something that is actually feasible, but we shall see if it comes together. So I guess make an appointment for this time next year to see if this is a successful course of action.